Now we're going to have a look at doing collision passes on the blockout. This is something where how much collision pass you have to do on a level might depend on the actual game that you're building. Generally speaking, if you're planning on iterating and actually scripting gameplay in your blockout, which hopefully you are before the art team has to go in and build the full pretty version of the level, you want to make sure that there's no snags. You want it to be a smooth experience so that the impression of the gameplay experience isn't marred by it. It's not confused by it. There's nothing confusing the kind of feedback you're getting when levels are being reviewed and play tested and iterated upon. So here's an example over here. We built this really rough broken tree branch to indicate how exactly the road was blocked out of the town here. So I'm going to grab my player start and move it over here so we can quickly just play test there. Okay, so if I hit play, right now, this isn't too bad, but say if I'm really clever, I can jump out of town here. But say I want to make sure nobody does. Or maybe say I could get stuck between these tree branches and say maybe there's some melee combat here versus an enemy. Just an example. And you don't want rough geometry like messing up the experience there. You want it to be smooth and clean. That's one reason why you might be blocking things like this, to prevent the player accessing places they can't go, and also smoothing out the area. Maybe there's smooth micro navigation that's needed in that area. One thing we're going to look at now is under here in the viewport, there's a useful tool for dealing with collision issues. It's under lit. We want to go to player collision. So right now it shows us the collision of everything in the world. And if we look around, we notice there's some big gaps, big disturbing gaps. So sometimes some things don't matter. For instance, right here in this view by our tree branch, this wouldn't really affect gameplay. But these rocks here that we placed in, they obviously have no collision by default. That's not a problem there. It is a problem here, however. If I look at player collision here, now that becomes a problem. So there's a couple different ways we can deal with this. One, we could use blocking volumes to sort of wrap those areas in collision. It kind of depends on what you need. There could be a situation where maybe the rough organic geometry of like a proxy rock mesh can't be smoothly wrapped enough, and you need to make it smoother than it is. In that case, you'd probably use just really clean, simple collision volumes around it. Otherwise, you could do this. We can go to edit the SM rock. Here it is in all its glory with its materials applied. If we go to collision, we want to view simple collision. We see that it has none. That's why nothing's showing up in that collision view. So there's a few ways that we can add collision to this. Really quickly, this is not a great way to do it. We could add boxes to it. It just bounds it in a box. That's kind of misleading. The box doesn't exactly, if we look at it, it doesn't exactly follow the contours of the rock. So that might be really misleading to people if we go that route. We go back to perspective. So I'm going to just delete that. If we go under collision, you can do remove collision. Another way we could do it, which may be better, depending, these are methods that would work best for blockout. Not necessarily a finished game, but it kind of depends on your project. But we could do auto convex collision. What that does is it uses this window, this convex decomposition with some properties set. It starts creating a hole around the polygons of this mesh. So right now, if we look at it, we can see these green lines. It kind of tried to wrap it. And you can make this more complicated if you want. You can up the hole count to 8. Max hole verts to, say, 48. You can change the precision. But then we end up getting maybe some expensive collision that we don't want. And it becomes like really taxing for the game to have to worry about colliding with such a complicated object. So you may have the ability to figure out a decent middle ground to apply auto convex collision like that. But for now, we're not going to do that. We're going to use a different method. So I'm just going to remove the collision from this. In fact, actually, if I save this, I'll have a quick look at it like this. Back in the blockout, we've added collision to all of these rock meshes. So if we go look at our collision view now, we can see that it didn't do a bad job with the collision, really. That's actually looking pretty nice. Like it looks good enough where I'd be happy to use that, at least for a blockout. But there is some other options we can do if we had to. We could wrap stuff in blocking volume. So we'll look at that now. In fact, we'll leave the rocks the way they are because they look pretty good. Let's look over here too. I want to make sure. I want to see where it buttresses the player path, and it seems like I can't complain too much. Anyway, if we want it more cleanly, here's an example. This tree branch, we'll add a volume, blocking volume right here, and you pretty much edit these the same way that you edit geometry brushes. It's the same geometry editing mode for volumes. So this shows up under collision, player collision view mode as a pink box. That's how you know a volume was added in. It's not part of the mesh collision, which appears this kind of like light teal color. So what we're going to do now is, I think I'll do a little bit of extrusion. So I'm going to go to Shift 4 again to the geometry editing mode. Once that's selected, I can grab faces here of the volume brush, and I can do things like extrusion. I can extrude it a couple of times. So once that's done, let's go to the top mode, top wireframe view mode, and let's get rid of extrude. We don't want to extrude anymore. So now with this setup, I can now like kind of sculpt and mold my collision. And this is pretty common stuff in a game with, say, like intense melee combat. You need to do a lot of this. Make sure your edges are very smooth. Or anything that's really close quarters. The more close quarters it is, the more I'd say you'd need some really highly polished collision like this. So now you can kind of, once we see how this looks in the editor in collision mode, we can see like we have a fairly clean collision hull. Now, if the player tries to move near this thing, they won't have an unpleasant kind of janky experience. So if I just hit play and run up against this thing, we can see like I can't jump over it. I can't get too close. You'd have to find the exact threshold you need there, but that's one way we could handle collision on really complex, jagged type surfaces.